Jonathan, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Happy to be here.
As I was doing some reading about how maybe this documentary, Memory is Our Homeland, came to be, it almost brought to memory, it brought back to me sort of memories I have of not speaking with my grandmother necessarily, but to my mother in law, which is sort of how I found out about the documentary and of course yourself. Um, on most occasions when we have dinner together, she'll just start chatting. Maybe something at the dinner table reminds her of something, or something somebody is wearing, or the type of day it is, and she'll just start talking about life back in Arusha. And
hmm
I can't remember. Maybe I told you when I first called you, but I can't remember what we were talking about that prompted her to tell us about these Polish families that all of a sudden came. She didn't say to Arusha, but she said there was a town nearby, that there was a lot of people from Poland that came there during World War II. She says nobody knows about this. And whenever my mother in law says these things, I pull up my phone and I go, is this another one of her long tales that she's telling?
hmm
And to my surprise, I go, oh, I looked at my wife. She's actually telling the truth. There's something to this. There's actually a documentary that was made about this. And so we started going on the phone, and I said, I just found Jonathan's number. Let me give him a call and talk about this. Um, so I thought I'd just tell you a bit about that. But Jonathan, I mean, tell me a little bit about your grandmother, the type of person that she was.
um, she was a great storyteller. I also, I love to listen to her tell her stories, and of course, they were quite interesting because they were of her incredible life, which started in Poland, 1928, and she was born on what was the border of the Soviet Union back then, but is now part of Belarus. And when she was 10 years old, um, the Second World War started. And from her perspective, the way that the way it impacted her life most directly from the start was that basically all of a sudden the Soviet army crossed the border into Poland from the east and occupied the eastern half of her country. So so that was in September 1939, September 17th, 1939, 2 weeks after the Nazis had invaded Western Poland. And there was a lot of confusion reigning at the time. Nobody could understand exactly what the Soviets were doing coming into Poland. They were making the claim that they were trying to help Poland maintain its territorial sovereignty in the face of German aggression. Of course, that was just a ruse. They were there to actually occupy the country and to jointly occupy it with Germany. So it is kind of ironic that we're having this conversation today, of all days, when the current president of Russia, rather, Vladimir Putin, has just today said that they're going to have to go into eastern Ukraine to secure Russian interests there, and Russian speakers and Russian citizens. So it's quite something that we're talking today. We're having this conversation because it's really, I mean, this is a very historic day from that perspective. But from my grandmother's perspective, she was just a kid. She was 10 years old when this all started. So September 1939, her town, which was like just a small farming community in the eastern borderline of Poland and the Soviet Union, saw the first presence of Soviet troops. And between September 1939 and February 1940, there were no one was quite sure on what was going to happen next. But then, February 1940, they got a knock on the door, and it was the NKVD, the secret police of the Soviet Union, who were there and who gave them 15 minutes and said, "Okay, get everything, get basically pack your things. You're leaving, and you're not coming back." And so, my grandmother, Kaja, who was 10 at the time, left with her parents and her sister and her two brothers, and they were loaded onto trains, and they were sent deep into Siberia from Poland. Um, and they were among hundreds of thousands of Poles who went through that. So, I say all that as like that's the history of what happened, but it's just sort of you asked me about my grandmother, and she was a fantastic storyteller, a very, dignified human being, somebody who you would cross in the street and you just say, maybe you think, oh, look at that, nice Eastern European lady, but you would never know that she'd had the life that she led, except for the fact that she carried herself with like, with I don't know, a certain quiet dignity that's like hard to put a finger on, but it's something that I found again and again with a lot of these survivors. So she was, she was a really great storyteller, but kind of not shy, but a little bit reserved in her own way. She didn't go out of her way to be the center of attention, but once she started talking, she would, bring you from Poland to Siberia to Kazakhstan, Iran, India, Tanzania, where she ended up in a camp, and then to England before coming to Montreal. So she was an incredible person. And on the other hand, she was a very modest and unassuming person that, again, you would never know she'd gone through this, but she had. So yeah, I mean, I feel lucky to have known her, not just because she was like, she was my grandmother, and
Sure,
that,
yeah.
that she was like a second mom to me, but, because she was actually an extraordinary person. So yeah, it's
Do you
that's her.
remember in the documentary? There's clips of present day of chatting with her, and I know before the movie was released. And correct me if I'm wrong. She had passed before the movie was released because I know you sort of
Yeah,
finished it. There was some time there, but there's some
yeah,
clips where you're much younger.
yeah.
And I don't know whether it was a school project that you were working on that your
Mhm.
grandmother was a subject in. But I'm curious, how old do you remember how old you were? Or yeah, how old you were when you first started, I don't want to say paying attention, but showing an interest in these stories.
Well, it's funny, because I mean, on the one hand, uh, I was interested from my first memories of her. So I was, maybe 4 years old or something. Like my first memory of my grandmother is literally of her telling me about growing up in Africa. And I was in her house in the suburbs of Montreal in LaSalle, and memories of like a house full of aunts and uncles and just Polish relatives, just like a big, raucous, loud, noisy house, cabbage cooking on the stove, cooking like cabbage rolls, guampki, they're called in Polish. And I was sitting on the ground and I was like looking through a children's atlas, from, I don't know, from the 60s or something. Illustrated children's atlas, map of the world, showing the different continents with the animals and the landscapes, like little drawings of it. And she pointed to the place that, that she had grown up, as she put it. And, there were elephants and there were lions and tigers and there was maybe Mount Kilimanjaro. I don't remember precisely. I remember the animals though. And she said, that's where your babcha grew up. That's your grandmother. She's saying that's where I grew up. And so I remember being, fascinated by it as a kid, as a little kid. I remember just imagining the animals and everything. But I never thought at the time. I didn't think that that was something strange that my, little Eastern European grandmother had grown up in a traditional mud hut for her adolescence, anyway, in Eastern Africa. So it really just sort of, the way we absorb stories from our parents and grandparents and families, I just took it for granted that my family had come from there. That all these aunties and uncles, and the older generation had almost all of them grown up in Eastern Africa as refugees. So it was really only when I got older, because like, especially as a young boy, as a young man, like as a teenager, you're listening to the stories of usually of male heroism, of like my grandfather had escaped a concentration camp, and he'd been smuggled out of Europe by the resistance, and he joined the Polish army, and he'd gone to fight. My Canadian grandfather had fought as well. He'd been there for D-Day and all this stuff. But meanwhile, there were all these older women in my family, who were in their, I guess, 60s or 50s when I was a kid, who had also been like badass OG, you know, fighters in their own way, right? But they were fighting for survival. They weren't fighting with guns. They were just fighting to survive as refugees, as people who were displaced. So it was really only when I got into my 20s and my late 20s, I basically I had an internship in South Africa. And I spent, 6 months in Southern Africa, like going around Botswana, South Africa, Swaziland, around that area. And I was like, shit, it's kind of weird that my grandmother grew up not far from here. Like, what is that actually about? And so I came home and had just a completely different perspective on her and her life. And it was, it's, I don't know how much you've traveled, like what if you've been around the world or what, but like the only person who really understood my travels to Asia or East Africa or whatever was my elderly grandmother, who, like, it didn't make sense to me that she was like the biggest traveler that I knew. But then I realized, coming back from like in my 20s, like going around Europe, Asia, Africa, whatever, everywhere I went, like basically my grandmother had already been there, and so it really gave me perspective that I'd taken for granted, that she was just this this figure like grandmothers are in almost every culture, like she had this very important role. But it was only when I came back, again, I was like a little bit older, a little smarter, a little wiser, and just a little more appreciative of the fact that she was not just a survivor, but she was somebody who didn't define herself that way as a victim of anything on the cup. She was just, she was just tough. And I just came to appreciate that, because like I realized that I was way more innocent than she was. And that was, so it was for me growing up a bit, it was realizing like I got nothing on her, my 5'2" grandmother, living in her apartment in LaSalle, was a badass, basically, you know,
I
really.
can,
So
yeah, I can
yeah,
imagine that. Were you already interested in storytelling and filmmaking at that time?
I'd always been interested in storytelling pretty much from a young age. I read a lot as a kid. Like I loved books and movies and stories in general. But also, I grew up in a house like of these people. My grandmother telling her stories, her sister, their friends, their cousins, like all these people that were like them were survivors, really, of the Poles anyway. That Polish part of my family, because my dad's Irish Canadian, or was Irish French Canadian. But yeah, so I grew up with a lot of storytellers, and yeah, so they had me interested in it. But it's when I was in South Africa doing this internship, I started basically filming people, in the suburbs of Johannesburg and around South Africa, in communities, like community organizations, just sort of, yeah, following people around, getting them to talk about their lives and their stories. And I was like, this is what I like to do.
When
So that's where it started. I was
yeah,
29, yeah, that
oh,
year.
wow. When did you decide the first time that you wanted to somehow tell the story of your grandmother's travels, and maybe I'm going to guess it wasn't what we can see today. I don't know. Was that the same story that you wanted to tell back when you first started?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple components, I guess, to your question. The first is like it it was a long process to get to the point that, like, just to get to the place where I felt confident enough to to pick up a camera, point it to her, and say, like, I can be a filmmaker. I want to be a filmmaker. I want to make this film. I was already, like I said, 29, 30, I think, when I did this documentary program at Enis in Montreal. But like the seeds of doing this story were planted when I was a kid. Really, I mean, it was like, and it's in the film. I tell a couple of these anecdotes, but being, remembering her talking about having like this, she sparked my imagination from a young age. Her stories sparked imagination in me of her travels. Then I went to McGill. I did an undergrad in political science and philosophy there. And, this is the late 90s. I'm studying at McGill. And it's been 10 years barely since the end of the Cold War, since the Soviet Union dissolved, since the archives were opened in the Soviet Union in Russia. And none of my professors knew anything about these Polish refugees in Africa. And there was one person who basically not denied that they'd been there, but sort of questioned me like, "Are you sure about that? Like, maybe you should check your sources." And my sources were my family. It was my grandmother. So it was like, that was when I was whatever, 20, 21 probably. I just sort of filed it away again. But it's with time, it sort of, I pieced it together that, like, not only had my grandmother and my family gone through this crazy history as refugees, as immigrants, but that it had been erased, like that there was that like erasure of trauma, and that we weren't using those words back then really, but that in a sense that I'd been gaslit by this professor, and that yeah, that sort of planted a seed. And then when I went and did the documentary program, we were doing some journaling, like as an exercise in our class, and we started talking about our families and what our backgrounds were, where we were coming from. And I started telling the story of how my family had ended up in Canada. My mom came as a refugee with her parents, and how my grandmother had gone through this thing, and people were just like, "What? She came from where?" I was like, "Yeah, she was like a refugee in Tanzania. Yeah, she spent the ages of 13 to 20 living in like a small hut with no door, like just a door hole at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro." Yeah, that's where she's from. And realizing that people found it interesting, and I don't know, it validated that history. Yeah, and it really, and it's like that, like I grew up in Ottawa. My last name is Durand. I'm like a white Catholic kid from the suburbs. It's easy to be French and English because of my family name and whatever. But and yet there was always this story in my family that made us, or at least made part of our family, outsiders and others. So I always felt a little piece of cognitive dissonance between this idea that it was our family was integrated, whatever. I had friends from everywhere, but like, um, there was this part of our family story that was unresolved. So
Yeah, when my mother-in-law first told me the story, and then when I found out about your film and you, and I started, just do some simple research, right? And it was like, I don't ever remember anyone telling me, about World War II in that way. It's like, no, the Russians at that time were the good guys. They're part of the good guy team. Um,
yep.
but they invaded Poland. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember what I was told, but it was probably along the lines of, the Germans, the Nazis invaded Poland, and Russia went in to help. Um, Not
Yeah.
that Belarus all of a sudden took shape, half of Poland essentially, and uh, yeah, it was just mind-boggling. My family and I, we went to Eastern Europe. I want to say the summer of 2019, I believe, and so we went to Poland. We stayed in. Oh my goodness, what's the name of that town? Can't remember off the top of my head. It wasn't Warsaw. We were told to go somewhere else, which was much more
Krakow.
historic. Krakow. Thank you.
Yeah, Krakow.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the south. It's a
So
beautiful
we
city.
stayed. Oh, just beautiful. We stayed there. We took a day trip to Auschwitz, and even going through there. I mean, that was horrendous. Um, that took a while to sort of recover from just as a visitor. But even there, I don't remember anything about you know there's other guys as well that did something to all the all the people that lived in Poland as well. But
Mm.
it's amazing as a student, sort of facing your professor, and I can just imagine, if that was me, what would I be going through? Do I go, yeah, maybe my parents who just came to this country don't know what they're talking about, or maybe this professor does, or whether I, be someone like yourself that go, no, my family went through this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'd soaked up all the official history very well through my like elementary school, high school, like going into university. I read a lot as a kid and as a teenager. And I said I knew history a bit, but none of it was mentioned. But there are reasons for that. There are reasons for that. I mean, like to to use the big words like what the Soviet Union did in Eastern Poland at that time was ethnic cleansing. It involved mass deportations of people into slave labor conditions, where hundreds of thousands of people potentially died. So it what happened between 1939 and 1941 was very dark. The problem is that because the Soviet Union also helped defeat the Nazis and became allied with the West, when they had the Nuremberg trials in 1946, to create the entire post Second World War legal structure for, to legal response and to deal with genocide and war crimes, one of the countries, one of the main countries on the that was judging the Nazis was the Soviet Union. So England and the States and Canada and France and the rest of those countries, they couldn't point out or draw attention to the crimes that had been committed by the Soviet Union, which were documented, which were known, proof of which exists in archives in the United States, in England. Like I've seen the documents, they're in my film. They knew exactly what had happened. They knew exactly what had happened, but they couldn't bring attention to it because that would undermine the case against Germany by drawing attention to the fact that the same thing, some of them had been committed by the Soviet Union. So the history was erased explicitly by the Soviets, also within communist Poland. Nobody there knew the story officially, and in countries like ours here in Canada and in the States, nothing was taught about it. Even in the Cold War, even though in the Cold War the Soviet Union was like our adversary, ostensibly, nothing was spoken about. So it's very strange, but that's how history works.
Yeah. Um, you took a break. I don't know if that's the right term.
Mhm.
When your grandmother passed away, did you always know you were going to come back and finish the film, or what was
Yes,
that like?
yeah, yeah. I mean, she passed away in 2012, so I had started, filming a little bit in 2008, 2009. First trip to Poland and Belarus in 2010. 2011, I go back to East Africa, and I find the village that she's from in Belarus, formerly Poland. And then she passed away very suddenly in 2012, just as I was doing an internship, or sorry, a residency um, in Berlin at a film festival, working on this project, and my grandmother passed away like right right around then. So I'd always envisioned the film basically as her story told by her sister, or by a couple of people in their periphery. So when she passed away, I felt like I lost not just my storyteller, but my historian. Like the main historian of her life. And I did. Of course, she was the she was an archive unto herself, like every survivor is. To talk about these things, but at the same time, I realized it was my story too. And coming from that history, that it was important to me to keep it alive and find a way to tell it, because it was part of me. I mean, not just culturally, but depending on how you think about genetics and whatnot, or just inherited, socialized inheritance of these stories. Like, it's definitely part of me and part of my family. So I felt like there was no way I could put it down. I couldn't turn my back on it. I had to tell it.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm guessing there's, to make a film, you need enough material. But when does it
Mhm.
come to a point, Jonathan, where there's enough for the film? Because I'm sure there's probably a lifetime of research that you could continue to continually, bring to light more information or more data or whatever it is. When did you know? Okay, I have enough to tie a bow on this project.
Um, I mean, that's a good question, but I mean, the honest truth is that there was funding that required me to finish the film. So that was, it could have just gone on open ended. I've kept studying this history. It's not like it's finished just because I made the film. When things happen like what's happening today in Russia and Ukraine, like I feel invested in it, because it's part of the same history. So um, how did I feel it was finished? So I found there's this archive in London, right, that has a large amount of Polish government in exile documents from the Second World War. So the Polish government is run out of Poland when the Nazis invade. They head to Paris. So the Polish government is located in Paris, and then the Nazis push into France. The Poles end up going to London. So the Polish government is in London for the better part of World War II. And of course, there's like correspondence, and there's ministry paperwork. Like, the government is still functioning, even though it's outside of Poland. And all of the documentation that they had stayed in London after 1945, when the war officially ended, because Poland became communist. So they couldn't bring the government that had been in place before the war. That government stayed in London, and so did all of the paperwork that they'd amassed over the course of World War II. So that paperwork ended up being warehoused in a in a private, like basically in a building that protected it till the end of the war, and with time it became a museum. So basically, to answer your question, I found documents in that archive that had been handwritten by my family and 18,000 other Polish refugees in East Africa. So these were, it's like the processing papers, basically. Like, folks were arriving from all over the place, but it escaped the Soviet Union for the most part. So about 18,000 Polish refugees ended up in 20 something camps across East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, down into Rhodesia, northern southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. A few went through Mozambique, some in South Africa. So I found the paperwork basically that proved, not just proved, it was actually like handwritten by my grandmother, my great aunt, my great grandmother, the rest of the family. The paperwork that was, for me, symbolizing, the physical trace, like the document, the artifact that that my professor and others had called into question or had asked for back in the day. Like, where's the proof? Okay, you got this story, great, that great story, but where's the proof? Which was a very, you know, tricky proposition in cases of ethnic cleansing where paperwork is deliberately destroyed, right? So I found these papers and I was like, this is it. Like, I'm looking at a handwritten page filled out, by my, at the time, 13-year-old grandmother, her fingerprint, her like, tiny cursive child's handwriting. And I was like, that, I'm coming into contact with this paper that is at this point, whatever, 75 years old or something, 80 years old. That to me was like, okay, this is how the film ends, is like tying it together from the beginning. It's oral history, it's me like absorbing all this over the course of my life, basically. And the film becomes like a collage of all these different elements, and here's the final piece. But then something incredible happened, which was like I had a conversation when I was in London finding and filming those papers. And essentially an archivist there mentioned some film reels that they had from Africa potentially. So I asked if he could digitize them, and we're sitting there editing the film, it's almost done, and all of a sudden I get an email that says, hey, we digitized that film reel from Southern Africa, here's a link. So I watch it, and it's 9 minutes of like b-roll unedited footage from the camp that my family was in. And not to give a spoiler or whatever, but in one of those shots I actually saw my grandmother as a kid in that camp in Tanzania. So that, jaw dropped, chills on the back of my neck. I was like, okay, this is really the end. This is the thing. This is a home movie shot by, the propaganda department of the British War Office in 1946 or something, 45, whenever, must have been during the war. And I'm looking at this thing that sat there unused for like all those years. So that for me was the end. That was like, okay, this is really the end, because I found these images and I'm using them to tell the story that was never told using them. So that was really for me a special moment to find that. I mean, it's like the chances of that happening.
Yeah, I remember that in the documentary. That was powerful. That was so very
Yeah.
powerful. It brings to question, this whole idea of proof. And I know that's not necessarily what your movie is about, but I'm curious your thoughts on, there's certain cultures where this idea of proof doesn't exist. It's like if your grandmother, your mother-in-law tells this story, then you believe that that's what it was. There's no need for, is there paperwork to corroborate that? Is there a home movie that can show
Right.
this? It's fascinating, this idea of um, of proof and evidence outside of oral.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's something that preoccupies me too. I mean, I studied philosophy in undergrad, and one of the uh, I remember one of the things we studied or read about was like the definition of, or the distinction between poetic truth and historical truth. And I can't remember if it's Aristotle or Plato. I think it's Aristotle, but anyway, one of the ancient Greeks says at the end of the day, poetic truth is actually more truthful than factual truth. And we tend to think that facts matter more, and you need forensic evidence, of an event. But at the same time, what I saw with my grandmother, and I've seen this throughout life, just as a human being, just with people, telling their stories or me telling mine, is that storytelling itself like contains a type of truth that sometimes the facts can get muddled, but like the emotion that's being conveyed is the more important thing sometimes, if you know what I mean. Like the human experience that's being told, like that's it's worth honing in on that and paying attention to it, because that can actually be more truthful than, whether the person turned right or turned left, and whether it was on February 21st or on February 22nd that they did it. It's what was going through their mind when that happened, what was motivating them. So that, yeah, that tension is like an important one, I think. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, like, because there are times I'll listen to people telling stories, and I'm just like, okay, wait, that doesn't really add up. But if they're telling a good story and they're a reliable narrator, then you gloss over like
The
those little
details, right?
details.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
it just
It's after finding out about this documentary. You know how we all carry our cell phones everywhere. Um, I now have it in my pocket at the dinner table. My mother-in-law starts telling a story. I'm pulling it out. I'm pressing record, and she
right.
knows. She knows she's being recorded. You
It's
know,
great. It's
but
smart. Yeah,
it's
that's.
press record. And I tell my wife, I said, your mother has so many stories
Hmm.
that will go with her if nobody records this. And I said, it doesn't even need to go to the world. I'll just upload it, and just you and your sisters will have access to it. And if you want to make it something bigger, make it something bigger. But for now, let's just capture it.
Right. Well, where is she? She should be part of the podcast. We should have her,
She
or
will
at
need
least
to
this
get
one,
her. Yeah, she needs to get her
separate.
hearing aids in, and
Okay, fair enough. How old is
you
she?
know,
If I can ask.
she's 80 something.
Okay, so
Yeah,
does she remember the polls like in
she
the
does.
camps? She was
Yeah,
a
yeah,
kid,
yeah.
and she, yeah, yeah,
Oh
yeah,
yeah, yeah. She remembers. She
that's really
remembers.
amazing.
And it was something. Your in the film, your grandmother and her sister. You guys are in London, I think, or in England somewhere.
Yep, in
And
Sheffield, England. Yeah,
it's just amazing that the stuff that they still have.
yeah,
I think you're asking for paperwork. There's a there's a disagreement on a date, uh,
exactly.
or how old they were or something, and they go, "No, I've got the
Yeah, they fight.
paper," and
Yeah,
they're looking at. I'm like, I can't believe they've kept this. Like it was meaningful
yeah,
enough for all these years from kids that they thought to keep it and not to
yeah.
get rid of it. It's just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that had an impact on me to see that they had those papers. I mean, growing up, like I knew that my grandmother had her box of papers, right? And her box of papers was like her high school diplomas and report cards from Tanzania, like, from the camps. Um, yeah, and knowing that that stuff was important to her. Also, my uh, other side of the family, but my dad was a forensic detective. So yeah, so he was a homicide detective in Ottawa. So it's like, yeah, I think I absorbed some of his influence as well, because his life was spent, trying to piece together the little broken pieces of a puzzle, trying to get the bigger picture out of like finding a few puzzle pieces on the ground and like trying to make sense of how they all fit together. So yeah, no, I mean that scene with my grandmother and her sister was that experience for me, like not just as a as a scene in a film, but actually for me as a person being there, having trusted my grandmother's memory and her stories, because she lived in Montreal, her sister lived in England, so I didn't see her sister all that often. I trusted my grandmother's memory, and all of a sudden we're in England at her sister's place. Her sister is just as convinced that she's right, and they are disagreeing about like a full calendar year of their lives. Like, no, 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 you're crazy. It was 1941. What are you talking about? It's 1942. And they're sitting there fighting over this. I'm like, so what is the truth? Like, which year was it? And then realizing, like, just to come back to what I was saying before, it actually didn't matter which year was true. In a sense, it wasn't about which year was true. It's that they were both so committed, like they were so uh, it was so important to them to remember correctly, that that's what was important. It's not which year it was, it's that it was the significance of memory. And yeah, that's what was important. So, and I mean, that scene in that film, like in the film, that has wherever I've shown the movie and people from whatever background, like whatever story, that ends up being the most relatable. Often is like everybody remembers that because we've all experienced it. You're like, you know what I mean, or you've seen it. Either you're the one arguing, or you're watching your whatever your mother and her sister, or your friends do it. So
Yeah, it's amazing because with dates, I'm the worst. I
yeah,
have to bookend it with when did I go to university? When did I graduate? When did I get married? Those are the dates that I'll remember. So things that'll happen, I go, where was I? So then I'll have to, it was between this year and that year. I still
yeah,
forget when the Jays won the World Series. I go, was it 91, 92, or was it 92, 93? You know? And
yeah,
I'll have to say it
yeah,
was the year after I started university.
yeah,
So it's fascinating that people can remember dates
yeah,
outside of just an event that happened. Because an event that happened, I can imagine that makes you feel something.
yeah.
But a date is it's just another Monday to me, right? You know.
Yeah, I think our era, it's harder for us to retain that information too because we have so many devices that can do it for us.
Yeah. Google
Whereas the
remembers
older,
for us.
which has its own problems, but my grandmother, her sister, all of those people, like to a person, the ones who do tell stories, because not all of them do,
Yeah.
the ones that do tell stories tend to have very, very sharp, lucid memories, like well into their 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's pretty impressive because I can barely remember what I ate for breakfast today, or what I was doing 2 weeks ago. So
I hear you. Tell me about showing this film in Moscow. That must have been outside of people that are interested. It must have been interesting. You must have come across a lot of people that were not happy that you were showing that film.
it was a really interesting and fascinating experience, because as a culture, as a country, I have tremendous like a deep affinity for Russian culture and art and history because there's so much that's come out of that place that's important to our collective human culture. At the same time, it's a country with a really brutal history of you know people being controlled, dominated, and sent to their deaths by tyrants and dictators. And it it was it was complicated to go back because I had this semi romantic idea that I was going to fly into Warsaw and then take the train to Moscow because the film was invited to screen at the Moscow Film Festival, like the Moscow International Film Festival in 2019, which I was surprised by. I'm like, why are they inviting me to show a film about the you know occupation and the annexation of Poland in Moscow, like under Putin and everything. But you know, it's a complicated country. They do this kind of things. Like a film like that would never show on state TV, but they will invite people to show these films in festivals and small, locales. So I took the train from Warsaw to Moscow. It's a 21 or 22-hour train ride through Belarus, and it actually goes on the same train track that my family was sent to Russia on. So I went past the village that my family was from, like on my way to Moscow to show the film about them being deported along that same train track that I was on. So, it was kind of trippy to like get to the point because I've studied old maps of the Soviet Union from the 1940s. I knew where the trains had gone and where they'd split off. So there was like a certain point where I'm on this train line. I knew that 80 years earlier, my entire family and hundreds of thousands of others had been deported to slave labor camps essentially in Siberia. And except there's a point where my train turns off, and I'm in a nice, like kitchen car, sleeper train, whatever. I'm doing just fine. but all of these people had been sent up, to face some pretty horrible things up there. So point being, I get off at the train station. I'm being picked up by somebody from the film festival, and it's this, nice young Russian woman who comes up and she's like, "So you must be the Canadian filmmaker." I was like, "Yes, that's me." She's like, "Everyone in the office found it very strange that someone would take a train instead of fly." It's like, "Well, I thought it would be nice to go on this journey." And she's like, "And how was your nostalgia trip?" I was like, "Oh, that's quite lovely, thank you." Um, Bottom line, it's a very cultured cinema audience there, and people know their history. Like people know the story of their country. I think once I in the Q and A's and all that, like once I acknowledged that uh, none of the Poles I talked to ever had anything um, bad to say about ordinary Russians ever. On the contrary, they would, always say the average people they came across in the Soviet Union at that time, like 1940 to 42 or so, they owed their lives to them in many cases. Because these are people under the Soviet Union, like at that time, who were suffering. And most of the Gulag victims were Russians, everyday Russians, right? So once I acknowledged at the screenings, like that this wasn't a film about Russian, um, crimes or something. It was about government crimes, like that the regime at the time had organized this terrible violence. That it wasn't really about the people per se of the country. Then everything changed really in those experiences because people understood that, like, people would relate to the film because they would say, we also grew up with our grandparents telling these stories about forced labor camps and losing family members and people disappearing. You know, so it was really, yeah, it was complicated, but a beautiful thing because it really, at the end of the day, the film I tried to make is not really meant to be about people's, like, the intention is not to focus on the pain and the suffering. It's to show the dignity and the humanity of the survivors. And in Russia and in other places I've shown it, that's what people identified with. Like they don't. It's a Polish story, but it's about a universal experience, which is about overcoming pain and trauma, really. So it was, I feel very grateful to have had a chance to go, especially because a year later, like, the pandemic started and all traveling stopped. So um, to have gone, I went twice to Russia. The film screened a couple more times there, actually. Yeah, I feel very fortunate. Uh,
Wonderful.
I hope to go back someday.
Good. Um, I read somewhere that there's an actual um, Polish orphan reunion.
Hmm.
Is that still? I guess past couple of years, I don't know what's happening, what's not happening. But does this community still exist? Is it still communicating
Yeah.
with one another? Yeah.
Not only does it still exist, they are, they were instrumental in helping this film get finished because once my grandmother passed, like, I interviewed her sister and their cousin and a few other people, but really what I started doing was going to these reunions because even though my grandmother was gone, I still wanted to connect to that history and you know piece it together for myself and for the film. So I started going to them in Connecticut. I went in South Africa. I went in Poland. I went in England, um, in Montreal. So these are people in many cases who ended up orphaned, right? So they lost their parents in Russia or somewhere along the way. So they see one another. The survivors, I mean, see one another as a family. So the pandemic has shifted things, but they have stayed in touch because really, I mean, they've known each other since they were kids, many of them, and yeah, if you're an elderly Polish person who wants to talk about your fond memories of the sun rising up over Mount Kilimanjaro when you were a teenager or whatever, that you're going to have to find other people who live the same thing. So it's yeah, they're really special events, like to go to see. Like I really love hanging out with elderly people in general, you know, but then to see these people like who had such a difficult childhood come together and have such fond memories is really instructive for me as a younger person.
That is amazing. Wow. The documentary is Memory is Our Homeland. I know the doc came out a few years ago, so I do want to thank you for taking the time to chat
Pleasure.
with me about it. It was just a great film to watch. Well done on it, Jonathan. Um, if people want to find out more about the doc, if people want to watch the doc, where can they go?
Go to memoriesourhomeland.com, the website, and if you click through, you can find the Vimeo on demand. There's a link there. It has been screening intermittently on Al Jazeera, the TV channel, Al Jazeera, the broadcaster. But their timing, it's intermittent, so you have to go and see if it's available. Although now with everything going on in Russia, who knows, they might be bringing it back. So
Yeah. Memoryisourhomeland.com. My guest has been Jonathan Durand. Jonathan, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
yeah, thank you. It was not only a pleasure to talk to you, but a pleasure to get a phone call from someone who knew about this history. That really made my night when that happened, and it was nice to talk to you, Karim.
Well, thanks for picking up the phone.
Yeah, I mean, I don't always from unknown numbers, but I'm glad I picked up yours. So there you
Awesome.
go.
Jonathan, before I let you go, is there anything you wanted to make sure listeners knew about, or do you think we did a good job covering everything?
I think we did a pretty good job of covering it. I'd say, yeah. I mean, find out about this history. Look into it if you're curious about it. There's more and more stuff coming out, which for me is has been nice. Like the one little last anecdote I would say is in the couple years, a few years now since the film came out, I've started getting emails from people, and in some cases, undergraduate students saying my grandparents went through the same thing, or someone I know went through the same thing. I was researching my that history, and I came across the film. So that's a good feeling to know that there are people in the same place I was 20 plus years ago who are finding the film and who are interested in their history. So that's so learn your roots, know where you come
Yeah,
from, study your history, and be you know
absolutely.
curious.
Yes,
Yeah,
and listen to your elders as they tell these stories of back home. You'll find it fascinating for sure.
always. Yeah, I remember they're the bridge to the past. Even if yeah, yeah, listen to your elders.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome, Jonathan. This has been great. Thank you again.
Thanks for the conversation. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you too.